Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to So Custom. Today's video is going to be the making of this little number. So this, just like my last one, is super quick, super easy to make. So if you're interested in seeing how I sewed it up, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a ponte. It has stretch in both directions, a little bit more across the fabric rather than up and down. It's in this gorgeous forest green colour, good for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my front skirt. I have 2 layers of that fabric underneath this pattern piece and a little notch just to indicate the top of my slit. So that's that done. So off camera, I've just tidied up the edges of that centre front seam on both pieces, and here I'm just laying one over the other, right sides together and pinning, and ready to stitch. Starting at the waist, at my 1 cm seam allowance, the whole way down to the top of my slit, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's how that looks. And off camera I'll give that seam a little bit of a press, which you can see I've done here. And this piece is now ready for side seams. But before I can sew up my side seams, I need to cut out my back. So my fabric underneath this piece is on the fold. I have one little notch in the centre at the waist. So that's that done. So just laying that back over my front, right sides together and pinning my side seams. And ready to stitch. So stitching here from the waist, the whole way down to the hem at my 1 cm seam allowance, backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's that done, and off camera I'll tidy up that seam on the overlocker. So you can see I've done that here. I've also given it a nice press. And while I was at the overlocker, I ran my hem through it and also mitered my corners, pressed up by my hem allowance and pinned. And for this dress, I've chosen to stitch the hems by hand. So I've just knotted my thread and I'm anchoring it just at that corner. So taking a tiny little stitch from the skirt at an angle down to the hem, tiny little stitch, at an angle back to the skirt, tiny little stitch, and repeating. So that's how that looks. And I'll finish that off camera the whole way around the hem, up one slit and down the other. And this is how it looks. So happy with that. So there's nothing more I can do to the skirt at this stage. So on to the bodice. This is my back. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a few notches here, one at the centre back neck, one at the shoulder, and 3 just around that curve that will help me ensure that when I line up my front, everything's where it should be. And on to the front. My fabric again underneath this piece is on the fold, and I have all of the same notches as the back. So that's my front and back all cut out. And off camera I've just ran those edges through the overlocker. I've done that on front and back. I've pressed up my hem there just by my allowance. That will help me out later on. And here I'm just laying my front over my back, right sides together, making sure my sleeve hems are turned up, lining up my shoulder notch and pinning. And ready to stitch. So starting at the bottom of the sleeve, back stitching at my 1 cm seam allowance the whole way up, and back stitching to finish. And of course I do exactly the same on the other side. So I just need to press that seam open. So that's that done. And now to create the channels on my sleeve, I just need to stitch through those overlock stitches on both sides of that seam. So starting at the neck, back stitching and sewing directly through those overlock stitches, taking it nice and easy here. I want these channels to be super straight, back stitching to finish. So that's one side done, and I'll finish stitching down the other seam allowance off camera along with the other sleeve, and after a good press this is how it looks. So I've got a nice little neat and tidy channel there at the bottom, and the same on the other side. So now I need ties to go through my channels, so I've just cut myself a strip of the outer fabric. It's about 1 inch wide. I'm folding it in half along its length and pinning, and I'm stitching about 5mm or so away from that crease edge. Back stitching to start, and back stitching to finish. Just pulling my thread at the end. I'll use that to help me pull the whole thing through to the right side, which I'm going to do next. So just using a darning needle and threading that extra little bit of thread through, tying it in a knot, and then threading the eye of the needle through the center of the fabric and pulling the whole thing through to the outside. And I've done that same exercise 4 times for my 4 ties. And now to thread these through the channels on my sleeves. So I'm using the darning needle again, so just pushing the eye of the needle through the channel I created earlier and pushing my tie through the whole way up to the top. So this is how that looks. Super happy with this. So just removing my needle, and now just to secure that tie in place at the neck. So I'm just running a couple of stitches within my seam allowance, as I say, just at the top of the neck. So that's how that looks. And off camera I've just trimmed off any excess tie there. And now that that's all secure, I can gather up my sleeve. So super happy with this. Now I just need to do it 3 more times. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So love how this turned out. And just to finish off the bottom of the ties, I've added these little brass cones, just to give a nice neat finish. So to apply the cones, I'm just threading the tie through the narrow end, pulling it out the large end, tying a knot, trimming off any excess tie, and then pulling the cone down over the top of the knot. Super neat and tidy, love this. So that's my channels all done and my ties all finished off nicely. So now to finish the neck. So I'm first of all going to start with the back neck, and here I've decided on a bias finish. So I've just cut myself about 1 inch wide strip of the outer fabric. I'm just lining it up with the back neck and pinning one end in place and ready to stitch. So stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start, taking it nice and easy here the whole way around that curve, back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So I just need to trim down that seam allowance in preparation for understitching. So I'm taking away probably about 2/3 here, and now pressing the bias away from the bodice, but making sure that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the bias. So you can see that here. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, stitching through the bias and that trim seam allowance in underneath, And all this is going to do is help that bias to stay nicely tucked in underneath and not roll too much to the outside. Backstitching to finish. So that's how that looks. And now to finish the bias, I just need to tuck that raw edge in underneath. Press in a nice little crease line and pin into place. So that's how that looks, and ready to stitch. So I'm stitching here right along that inner crease edge. I'm taking it nice and slowly, trying to be as neat as I possibly can be. Backstitching to start and backstitching to finish. So that's how that looks, so pleased with that. So I just need to trim away that excess bias and give the whole thing a good press. So that's that done, so happy with that. So that's my back neck complete. Now for the front I've decided on a facing. So I have one layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece on the fold, one little notch at the centre. So that's that done. And off camera I've just ran that outer edge through the overlocker just to tidy it up. And here I'm just laying that facing right sides together with my bodice front, lining up my notches and pinning. And ready to stitch. So stitching at my 1 cm seam allowance, backstitching to start. And backstitching to finish. So that's how that looks. And just like the bias before, I want to understitch this piece as well. So I've just trimmed away about 2/3 of that seam allowance. I've pressed the facing away from the bodice, but made sure that that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against the facing. And ready to stitch. So stitching through the facing, through that trimmed seam allowance in underneath, and I'm about 1 millimetre or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew. Backstitching to start, taking it nice and gentle around those curves, and backstitching to finish. So that's that done. So I've given that a nice press off camera, and I have one last thing I need to do before the neckline is finished, and that is just to tuck in the facing edges across the top of the shoulder. So just folding that raw edge in underneath and pinning in place. Same thing on the other side, and now stitching in the ditch. And all that means is I'm placing my needle directly in that shoulder seam and making sure that I'm picking up that facing in underneath. And this is doing a couple of things. Number one, it's helping the facing to stay tucked in underneath. Number two, it's finishing off the facing at the side and also covering up that bias at the back, and overall just giving a nice neat finish around the neck. So now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So just laying one over the other, right sides together, lining up those notches you saw me clip earlier, lining up my hem and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 cm seam allowance, backstitching to start, and backstitching to finish. So that's that done. And off camera, I'll just tidy up that seam and give it a bit of a press. So you can see I've done that here. And I've also just hand stitched the hem of my sleeve in exactly the same way as I did the skirt. And now that that's done, I'm ready to join my bodice to my skirt at the waist. So just popping my hands through the bodice, pulling the skirt waist through, lining it up with the waist of the bodice, and pinning. First of all at the centre front, so lining up that notch, lining up my side seam, centre back notch, and my other side seam. And ready to stitch. So stitching again at my 1 centimetre seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So now I just need to tidy up that edge and press that seam allowance up towards the bodice. So you can see I've done that here. So I want to pop some elastic at the waist, so I'm going to use this seam allowance as the casing. So to do that, I just need to sew down the edge of that seam allowance to the bodice. So just like sewing the channels before, I'm stitching directly through those overlock stitches, trying to be as neat as possible here, back stitching to start, and finishing stitching with a back stitch, but about 1 inch away from my first stitch. That's just going to give me a little gap that I can feed my elastic through, which is what I'm doing here. So I've just popped a pin on the end of my elastic, and I'm using that this time to feed my elastic through that little channel. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So I just need to join those 2 ends of elastic. So I've just popped a pin in there, and I'm just running a zigzag stitch over the top. Forward and back a couple of times, and this is how that looks. So now the very last thing I have to do is just close up that little gap. Back stitching to start, right along that edge, and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have my elastic all in at the waist, nice and neat and tidy. I've got those channels and ties right the whole way down my sleeve. Got my sleeve hem all nicely hand stitched, that facing on the front and bias on the back neck. Super neat and tidy. That gorgeous dolman shape of the sleeve, and that super practical, super nice slit at the front with the hand stitched hem. And this is what it looks like on. So I love how this has turned out. And as you've just seen, is so quick and easy to pull together. I love the length of the skirt, the shape of the skirt, the shape of the bodice, those sleeves. Absolutely gorgeous, super practical, comfy, cozy little dress. Brilliant for winter time. And if you've been following along on Instagram, you might have seen another version of this. If not, you will see it soon. But anyway, love how this one turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!